What if everything you thought you knew about the deadliest conflicts in human history was only half the story? Most people, if asked to name the single most catastrophic war in human history, would answer without hesitation, World War II. And by raw numbers, they would be correct. Between 60 and 75 million lives were extinguished in that global conflagration. It stands as the largest absolute loss of human life in recorded history. But here is the question that most history books never quite get around to asking. What if we measured destruction, not by the total number of dead, but by the percentage of all humanity that was wiped from the earth? What if the true scale of devastation had nothing to do with machine guns or atomic bombs, but with the quiet, systematic collapse of the very social structures that keep human beings alive? When we reframe the question that way, the answer changes completely, and some of the most catastrophic events in human history turn out to have happened not in the 20th century, but in ages so distant that most of US have never even heard their name. And alongside those ancient catastrophes, there is another story that demands to be told. A story not of armies clashing on open fields, but of an entire economic system built on the deliberate reduction of human beings to property. A system so profitable, so deeply embedded in the logic of its time, that it took a civil war to bring it down. And even then, the ideas that made it possible did not simply disappear. Today, we are going to follow both of these threads through history, not to shock or to sensationalize, but to understand, because history is not a collection of distant events. It is the architecture of the world we live in right now. Welcome back, and thank you so much for being here. How are you doing today? I genuinely mean that. In a world that moves faster every day, I am glad you took a moment to slow down and explore something that matters. Let's go on this journey together. If you find yourself drawn into this story, go ahead and hit that like button. It takes 1 second, and it means more than you might think. It tells us that what we are making here is worth continuing. And if you are new to the channel, consider subscribing so you never miss what comes next. Now, let us begin. To understand the true scale of ancient violence, we need to first establish a point of comparison. The First World War, fought between 1914 and 1918, killed somewhere between 18 and 20 million people. Measured against the world population of that era, that represents roughly 1.1% of all humanity. The 30 Years' War, a brutal religious and political conflict that tore through Europe between 1618 and 1648, killed between 4.5 and 8 million people, accounting for somewhere between 0.8 and 1.4% of the global population. The Napoleonic Wars took between 3.5 and 7 million lives, amounting to roughly 0.4% of the world at the time. And World War II, for all its unprecedented horror, claimed between 2.5 and 3.2% of the global population of the mid-20th century. These are staggering figures, and yet, when we journey further back into history, the proportional devastation grows even larger. Let us begin in the middle of the 19th century, in southern China. Between 1851 and 1864, a cataclysmic civil war, known as the Taiping Rebellion consumed the Qing dynasty. A man named Hong Xiuquan, who believed himself to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ, led a movement that combined millenarian Christian ideology with the deep frustrations of China's rural poor. What followed was not merely a military uprising. It was a total social implosion. Between 20 and 40 million people died, not just from combat, but from the famine and disease that erupted in the wake of destroyed farmland and shattered supply lines. As a proportion of the world's population at the time, the death toll reached approximately 3.67%. That figure quietly surpasses the proportional death rate of World War II, the war that defined the 20th century's capacity for destruction was, in relative terms, less catastrophic than a conflict most people in the Western world have never studied. Now let us go back even further, to the 13th and 14th centuries, and the conquests of the Mongol Empire. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, armies of horsemen swept across the Eurasian continent in a campaign of expansion. Unlike anything before or since, the cities of Central Asia, Persia, China, and Eastern Europe did not simply fall. They were systematically erased. The famous libraries of Baghdad were burned. Sophisticated irrigation systems that had sustained agriculture for centuries were deliberately destroyed. Entire populations were put to the sword as a warning to those who might consider resistance. The death toll from the Mongol conquests is estimated at between 30 and 60 million people, representing somewhere between 7 and 13.5% of the entire human population of that era. In other words, roughly 1 in every 8 to 14 people alive on Earth at that time died as a direct or indirect result of Mongol expansion. The scale of that loss is almost impossible to absorb, but even that was not the peak. Take a moment and think about this. In the year 755, on the eve of what historians call the An Lushan Rebellion, the Tang dynasty of China was arguably the most sophisticated civilization on Earth. Its capital, Chang'an, was the largest city in the world. Its culture, poetry, and trade networks radiated influence across all of Asia. Then a general named An Lushan, commanding a massive border army, raised the flag of revolt against the emperor. What followed over the next 8 years was not simply a military conflict. It was the unraveling of an entire civilization. Farms were abandoned, supply networks collapsed. Refugees fled in the hundreds of thousands, only to encounter famine and epidemic along their routes. The Tang census conducted before the rebellion recorded approximately 53 million registered households. After the rebellion, that figure had fallen to less than 17 million. When historians account for those killed in the fighting, the displaced, the starved, and the dead from disease, the An Lushan Rebellion may have killed as many as 1 in every 6 people alive on Earth at the time, approximately 16% of the global population, more than any other single conflict in recorded human history, measured proportionally. Here is something I want you to sit with for a moment. None of those catastrophes involved nuclear weapons. None involved industrialized killing on a mechanized assembly line. The reason ancient conflicts could destroy such a vast proportion of humanity comes down to a simple and terrifying truth. When war destroys the social infrastructure that keeps people alive, the dying does not stop when the fighting stops. Famine follows, epidemic follows. The collapse of a dynasty is not merely a political event, it is the removal of the scaffolding that holds a civilization together, and everything built upon that scaffolding comes crashing down. Here is a question I want to leave with you. Which of the conflicts we have discussed so far do you think offers the most important lesson for the world today? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. Now let us cross the ocean and move forward in time to the American South in the decades before the Civil War, the era known as the antebellum South, roughly from the late 18th century up to 1861, presents us with a different kind of catastrophe. Not the sudden, explosive violence of a military conquest, but the slow, systemic violence of an economy built on the forced labor of enslaved human beings. Understanding this system requires us to look at it the way its architects looked at it, not through our moral lens, but through theirs. Because only by understanding its internal logic can we understand why it lasted as long as it did, why it was defended with such ferocity, and why its collapse required a war that killed more Americans than any other conflict in the nation's history. Slavery in the antebellum South was, first and foremost, an extraordinarily profitable business. The average price of an enslaved person ranged from $300 to $500, reaching as high as $800 in the years just before the Civil War, at a time when white laborers were earning roughly $1 a day. That represents an enormous initial investment. A prime field hand, a healthy young adult male, in peak physical condition, could cost nearly 3 times the average price. Adjusted for inflation, that is the equivalent of close to $300,000 in today's money. This meant that outright ownership of enslaved people was economically beyond the reach of most white Southerners. Only about 1/4 of Southern households owned any enslaved people at all, and as tends to be true with concentrated wealth in any era, a small minority at the top owned the vast majority. For those with sufficient capital or access to credit, the standard approach was to buy in bulk at estate auctions or bankruptcy sales, particularly in the older southern states like Virginia, where soil, exhausted by generations of tobacco cultivation, had made agriculture far less profitable. Enslaved people purchased there would then be forcibly marched hundreds of miles south to Mississippi, Alabama, and the other deep South states, where cotton could be grown. Families were separated without ceremony. People who had spent their entire lives in one community were torn away and sent to a place they had never seen, to labor for strangers who regarded them as capital assets. As for the land itself, the federal government played a direct and active role in making the system expand. After forcibly dispossessing Native American peoples from their territories, the government sold that land at prices so low they amounted almost to a gift, initially at $1 per acre and later as low as 12 cents. Put differently, for the price of purchasing a single enslaved person, a buyer could acquire more than 1,000 acres of some of the most fertile land in North America. When Texas was annexed into the Union in 1845, it opened yet another frontier. In just 15 years, the enslaved population of Texas grew from 30,000 to nearly 200,000. The engine driving that growth was cotton, and behind cotton was the insatiable appetite of the British textile industry. The mechanical invention that made all of this scale possible was the cotton gin, developed by Eli Whitney in the 1790s. With it, enslaved workers could clean 50 pounds of cotton in the same time it had previously taken to clean a single pound by hand. The productivity gains were transformative, and the profits that flowed from them were staggering. Southern planters were routinely earning annual returns upward of 15% on their investment. That is a figure that outperforms the stock market in virtually any decade you care to examine. Stay with me here, because this is where the story gets genuinely revealing. Unlike the factory owners of the industrial North, who could hire and fire wage laborers, as market conditions shifted, the slave owner faced a fundamentally different economic structure. An enslaved person who fell ill still needed to be fed and housed. An enslaved person who was injured still required medical attention. If an enslaved person died, that was not merely a human tragedy. In the eyes of the planter, it was the total loss of a capital investment, and Southern newspapers of the era contain remarkably candid lamentations from planters mourning their enslaved dead in explicitly financial terms. Meanwhile, a northern factory owner facing a cholera outbreak among his workforce could simply dismiss the sick and advertise for replacements. The docks of New York and Boston were never short of desperate Irish or German immigrants, willing to take whatever work was offered. The slave system, for all its profitability, was one epidemic away from financial catastrophe for anyone who had borrowed heavily to build it. And then there was the fear that haunted every planter, from the smallest holding to the grandest estate, the fear of rebellion. Large-scale organized uprisings by enslaved people were relatively rare in the American South, but small acts of resistance were constant. Deliberate work, slowdowns, broken tools, feigned illness, escape attempts, occasional violence, these persistent, daily acts of defiance imposed a perpetual cost on the system, forcing the development of what amounted to a primitive surveillance apparatus across the entire South. The Slave Patrol, an organized force of armed white men with legal authority to stop, search, and punish any black person found outside, without written permission from an owner, became a defining institution of Southern society. It was not incidental to the system. It was the system's immune response, the mechanism by which a society built on coercion maintained itself against the will of those it was coercing. By 1860, the total monetary value attributed to enslaved people in the American South had exceeded $3 billion. That figure surpassed the combined value of every railroad, every factory, and every bank in the northern states. On the eve of the Civil War, the price of enslaved people had been rising steadily for 15 consecutive years. This was not a dying institution, struggling to survive. It was an expanding one, more profitable than ever, and its defenders had every economic incentive to protect it by whatever means necessary. When Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party, which had run on a platform of restricting the further spread of slavery, won the presidential election of 1860, 7 Southern states seceded from the Union before he was even inaugurated. 4 more followed shortly after. Had the Union not moved militarily to restore itself, the planter class would almost certainly have continued extracting profit and inflicting suffering for generations to come. The moral argument alone had not been sufficient. It took a war. But here is the profound irony that history delivered. The very structure of the slave economy, the overwhelming concentration of southern wealth in human chattel rather than in industrial infrastructure, proved to be the Confederacy's fatal strategic weakness. Approximately 90% of American industrial capacity was located in the North. Around 70% of the nation's railroad network ran through Northern Territory. Modern warfare in the industrial age ran on iron and coal and manufactured ammunition, not on cotton and human suffering. An economy built on the exploitation of others is not merely a moral catastrophe. As the Civil War demonstrated with brutal clarity, it is also a long-term strategic failure. Now, let us pull back and look at both of these historical threads together, because the connection between them is not coincidental. From the proportional devastation of the An Lushan Rebellion to the economic architecture of the antebellum plantation, we see a recurring pattern. When a society organizes itself around the extraction of value from a subordinated group, whether that group is a conquered population, subjected to war's secondary horrors, or an enslaved workforce, legally defined as property, the system generates enormous short-term returns while simultaneously building structural fragility into its very foundations. The Mongol conquests created the largest contiguous land empire in history and opened trade routes that connected east and west. They also depopulated vast stretches of Central Asia and damaged agricultural systems that took centuries to recover. The southern plantation economy made the American South one of the wealthiest regions in the world. It also created a society so militarily and industrially underdeveloped that it could not survive a prolonged modern war. The critical question that history keeps asking us is not simply whether these systems were wrong, though they were. The more instructive question is, what does it cost, structurally and eventually materially, to build a civilization on the subordination of others? And is the answer ever different from the one history keeps delivering? The An Lushan Rebellion collapsed the Tang dynasty's population by 2/3 within a decade, not because of the fighting alone, but because the collapse of governance removed the systems that kept ordinary people alive. The southern slaveholders lost their war not because they lacked courage, but because they had poured their capital into human beings rather than into the industrial capacity that determined the outcome of 19th century warfare. In both cases, a system that appeared unassailable from the inside revealed its hidden vulnerabilities only when pressure was applied from the outside. What does that tell us about the systems we inhabit today? Global supply chains currently connect billions of people in networks of extraordinary complexity and productivity. But, as recent decades have demonstrated, those networks are also deeply fragile. The social contracts that hold modern democracies together have proven more durable than many predicted, but they are not indestructible. The institutions that protect civil rights and human dignity are genuinely powerful, but they require active defense in every generation. History does not protect them automatically. People do. The planters of the 19th century South were convinced, right up until the moment of defeat, that their system was not only profitable but permanent. The courtiers of the Tang dynasty, surrounded by the splendor of Chang'an in the summer of 755, could not have imagined what the following 8 years would bring. Certainty about the permanence of existing arrangements is perhaps the most consistently misleading feeling in all of human experience. History has not ended. It has simply changed its vocabulary. What aspect of today's world do you think future historians will look back on with the same disbelief that we feel when we study the antebellum South? I genuinely want to know. Leave your answer in the comments below, and let's have that conversation. If today's video gave you something to think about, please take a moment to like it and subscribe. Every one of those actions helps this channel reach people who are looking for exactly this kind of honest, unvarnished look at the past. Next time, we will go even deeper. Until then, take care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next one.